Lastly, arousal was defined by Weinberg and Gould in 2007 as being a blend of physiological and psychological activity in a person, and it refers to the level of motivation, alertness, and excitement at a particular moment. The- They also defined it as a general physiological and psychological activation varying on a continuum from deep sleep to intense excitement. These definitions show that it is a level of readiness to perform by preparing the body for action. It can be influenced by the reticular activation system, which regulates and monitors the body's level of stimulation as a response of the signals sent from the hypothalamus and increasing levels of adrenaline. An athlete can experience too much, too little, or the perfect amount of arousal. This is called over-arousal, under-arousal, and optimum arousal. At optimum arousal level, athletes will be able to perform at their best, called optimal performance, whereas too much or too little can mean that they do not perform well. Different levels, different athletes and sports will have different optimal levels of arousal. For example, beginners in a sport are less knowledgeable and therefore need to focus more, whereas elite players can compete with higher arousal and do not need to think about what they're doing as much. Likewise, sports that require more concentration, for example darts, will demand a lower level of arousal compared to a high intensity sport, for example rugby. Under-arousal of an athlete can cause boredom and make the player lose focus, whereas over-arousal can cause the athlete to become stressed and eventually choke, causing their performance to be poor. Heightened cognitive anxiety can trigger decreased arousal because as the athlete gets more apprehensive, they're going to get more and more concerning about their ability to and making them feel more nervous, possibly making possibly meaning they won't be able to concentrate in the event. Different levels of arousal can affect the attention span and concentration of athletes. Under-arousal will give athletes a wide attention field so that they are easily distracted. For example, when a footballer takes a penalty, they may be distracted by the opponent's fans trying to put the penalty taker off. At optimum level, the athlete will have the ideal attention field so that information is absorbed and accurate decisions can be made and acted on effectively. For example, a defender in football may become familiar with the opposing striker's technique and skills, therefore they can use it against them and prevent the striker from producing goal-scoring opportunities. Lastly, over-arousal will give the athlete too much of a narrow attention field and they become hypervigilant, so they are not focusing on the important stimuli. For example, snooker players may rush into shots without recognising where all the balls are and possibly making the wrong decision. Athletes can control their stress, anxiety, and arousal by recognising their signs of arousal and state anxiety and making training specifically for their needs. One somatic technique an athlete can use to maintain their anxiety and stress is by doing breathing control in the form of diaphragmatic breathing. By focusing on and controlling their breathing, they will relax their body and muscles. A cognitive anxiety that an athlete could use to control their anxiety and stress is through imagery. The athlete can picture themselves performing a skill or competing successfully to ease their apprehension and build confidence on their ability prior to games. There are three theories on arousal, starting with the drive theory of Hull 1943 and Spence and Spence 1966. This model proposes that arousal and performance have a forever linear relationship, suggesting arousal is directly proportional with performance. This shows that an increase in arousal will cause an increase in performance. The drive theory can be evident in sports at a high intensity and therefore players can compete with high levels of arousal. For example, weightlifters who have high levels of arousal will be able to psych themselves up and be prepared and prepare themselves to lift heavy barbells, whereas if they're under aroused, they will not be mentally or physically prepared enough to be able to lift it as easily. This implies that a rugby player who had a higher level of This would also imply that a rugby player who had higher levels of arousal compared to an opponent would play better. This theory, however, could be criticised because it does not give consideration to how effectively a skill has been learned by the athlete, suggesting that a novice football player could be more aroused and therefore better than a more skilled player. Furthermore, some sports have skills that require focus and concentration, for example, putting in golf or taking a free throw in basketball. Therefore, having high levels of arousal might not allow you to concentrate finely and perform better. The next theory is the inverted U theory by Xerxes and Dodson in 1908. This model proposes that as arousal increases, performance gradually does, until a maximum performance at an optimal arousal point. However, further past this point, increases in arousal will cause performance to gradually decline, suggesting a curvilinear relationship between arousal and performance. For different types of skill, it is suggested that the optimal point is at different levels of arousal. For example, it suggests that fine complex skills, for example taking a free throw in basketball, have an optimal performance at a lower arousal than a simple gross skill, for example taking a goal kick in football. Similarly, athletes with different levels of ability will have the optimum arousal at different places. For example, semi-pro footballers will have a lower optimal arousal for maximum performance than Premier League footballers. Again, this theory could face criticism because their optimal arousal may not always occur in the centre of the curve. Also, the decline in performance as a result of over-arousal may not always be gradual. For example, a darts player may be performing at their optimal arousal and therefore best performance until they need to get a specific double to win. They may build up cognitive anxiety from apprehension and therefore arousal levels will rise. The consequence of the player being over-aroused will mean that they don't hit what they needed, causing a greater drop in performance rather than gradual decrease. The last theory is Fagin Hardy's 1988 catastrophe theory. They propose that the performance does not always gradually deteriorate as arousal rises, as stated by the inverted U theory, depending on the level of cognitive anxiety the athlete is experiencing. Whilst the athlete's somatic anxiety is high and cognitive anxiety is low, their performance will follow the inverted U theory. Whereas when they have high cognitive anxiety, as arousal increases past the athlete's optimal arousal, their performance will see a dramatic decrease, as shown by the vertical straight line. The vertical straight line in performance. In the case of a catastrophe, the performer needs to relax and decrease arousal rather than small reductions, which will put them back on the curve towards their optimal point. For example, a boxer who suffers psychologically may see uncontrollable increases to arousal, therefore the punches will be sloppy and wild, rather than controlled and tactical. This theory, however, also faces criticisms because it suggests it is a model for all athletes, but does not take into account the psychological strength of athletes who can control their cognitive anxiety and arousal, In the first scenario, it is said that Nick struggles to play the more precise and accurate shots. This shows that Nick's anxiety has led to him being over-aroused to play badminton at his optimum performance, as suggested by the inverted U theory. Over-arousal will cause his performance to gradually decline, causing him to miss the precise shots that require concentration. It says that he never seems to be able to apply the tactics that he practices in training. This shows that because of the increased cognitive anxiety caused by his competitive anxiety, he becomes so highly aroused that he cannot perform what he practiced, as he cannot concentrate, also suggested by the inverted U theory. Also, it says if he makes an error, his performance falls apart. This shows that the high levels of arousal means that he cannot perform well. Furthermore, the high presence of cognitive anxiety suggests that he experiences catastrophe theory, where his performance will dramatically deteriorate if he's over-aroused. In scenario 2, Sarah underperforms in the tough rival matches. Her teammates do not help to calm her down or be supportive, which can put more pressure on Sarah to perform. This shows that she has high levels of cognitive anxiety, which will produce high levels of arousal. The catastrophe theory implies that her over-arousal, paired with her high cognitive anxiety, will lead to dramatically lower performance, causing her scoring average to go from 86% right down to 32%. Whereas Rachel is said to thrive on the atmosphere and challenge. The fact that she does not seem to experience high levels of cognitive anxiety, the catastrophe theory, suggests a similar model to the inverted G theory, which means that she will have a curvilinear relationship between arousal and performance. Also, she has been given the Player of the Game award for several games. This shows that she performs near or at her optimal arousal, as suggested by the inverted G theory, allowing her to perform at her best and therefore be named the best player.